Moondrop makes some well-known IEMs. To date, they have presented some excellent options, particularly for the budget-oriented. Recently, they released their first headphones, which they call the Void. This product costs $200. Shenzhen Audio sent me the Void to review. Shenzhen is one of the few online retailers that specializes in hi-fi gear. If you're curious what China's factories have come up with next, chances are that Shenzhen Audio will have something to pique your interest. Check them out if you're in the market for new gear. Now, let's get on with the Void and try to figure out if it's another Moondrop success. Moondrop says that the Void was developed in-house, including making custom drivers. They say that the driver diaphragms are designed for, quote, better performance of mid-bass and details in the treble region. They promise that the Void matches the HRTF target. They say that the Void meets the demanding requirements of music lovers and specialized monitoring in the field of professional music production. Apparently, Moondrop spent 3 years designing and perfecting the Void. They say that the low price was achieved by the use of proprietary injection molds, which, to be honest, seems a little bit counterintuitive. Typically, designing and manufacturing new molds is a costly endeavor. The most succinct statement about the Void is found in the middle of the marketing webpage. The Void, quote, does full justice to the original music on the objective level, end quote. Moondrop all but guarantees that the Void is the standard for HRTF headphones. The Void catches your eye for better or worse. It looks familiar and alien at once. I'm convinced I have seen its general outline many times before in the sub-$100 headphones that litter Amazon and AliExpress search results. At first glance, you might think that the Void is painted white. Upon closer inspection, and this might not be obvious in the video, the paint has a pearlescent texture. This takes the Void out of the boring white category and into the interesting shiny white category. The headphone is made with a generous heap of plastic. The plastic feels light and hollow, and not too dissimilar from the feel of the HD6XX. The headband structure is metal. The ear cups are oval-shaped and have both vertical and some horizontal adjustment. Unfortunately, the vertical adjustment is stopped at the yoke, which means you cannot move the ear cups past 90 degrees. The ear pads are synthetic leather and use typical foam as inserts. They feel quite spongy and slightly angled. The ear pads are proprietary and can be replaced, but will require you to buy new ear pads directly from Moondrop or one of its dealers, assuming such ear pads exist at the time. The headband padding is sparse. It is again made of the same stuff as the ear pads. The Void comes with a braided dual 3.5mm cable. This cable is very nice. It transmits little to no microphonics and seems sturdy. You also get a 3.5mm to 1/4 inch adapter. Unfortunately, that's the end of the accessories. You don't get a carrying bag and obviously no spare ear pads. As for comfort, this is where the Void takes a nosedive in some respects. While the headphone is very light, it also has a fairly tight clamp. Over time, with regular use, this will decrease, but out of the box, the clamp force might be a bit much for some people. The ear pads and headband do not feel particularly soft. While the ear pads fully engulf my ears, the ear pads feel plasticky on my skin, which is of course to be expected considering that they're made of plastic. The biggest issue with the comfort is that the Void simply does not present a full seal around my ears. There's a gap at the bottom of the ear pads, and I always felt that the ear cups needed to swivel further back or past 90 degrees to make a more comfortable fit. The vertical adjustment is just too limiting. This reminds me a lot of the Blonde BL30's problem with its ear cups. I think the Void's fit issue might be alleviated with the use of thicker ear pads or those with a more significant angle, but that's not possible. Since these are proprietary ear pads, there's nothing you can do to make alterations in this regard. I tried wearing the Void in different ways, slightly forward, slightly back, making one side longer than the other, but I could never get a full seal. Ultimately, the Void is kind of a mixed bag when it comes to build and comfort. The construction material is nothing special, but is consistent with some popular alternatives, such as the HD6XX or the HD660S. The Void is light. while it has a tight clamp that will decrease over time with continued use, to some degree. Unfortunately, fit will be a problem for some, if not many. And of course, while the cable is quite nice, the fact that the Void uses proprietary earpads means you cannot replace them at your leisure. To test the Void, I used it with my RME 882 DAC, Brooklyn DAC Plus, Low 2 PAW 6000, and Eco Zerta ITM03. I used the stock accessories and listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Void is fairly easy to drive. You don't need any special amplification. Moondrop says that the Void has better mid-bass, which is a pretty vague statement. My tests indicate that the Void has a sub-bass roll-off and a fairly neutral mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The Void presented this detail, but it was rather faint. The rumble was noticeably louder on the more neutral audeze 4X. Transients was a little faster on the Void. When the crescendo hit, the Void made the organ meld with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was underemphasized and sounded a step behind the other instruments. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the other instruments. In Conquered by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The Void presented this sound and the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the Void rendered them all similarly. In other words, the various drums all had hard impact. None of the strikes sounded piercing or sharp. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the Void barely rendered the sub-bass, and when compared to the audeze 4X, sounded underemphasized. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the other end of a large room when I listened on the Void. The vocals were about 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were louder than the sub-bass, obviously. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these tracks to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, it seems that the Void has an obvious sub-bass roll-off. Mid-bass seems close to neutral. There's about average clarity in this region. My test suggests that the Void has forward mids with sibilant vocals. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilants mixed into the track. The Void presented and emphasized both. This was obvious when I compared the Void against the more neutral Avantone planar. The Void sibilance push was similar to what I heard on the audeze 4X. However, the S4X did not emphasize the vocal grain like the Void does. Still, the Void sibilance emphasis was far less than what the HD560S does. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. All mid-centric instruments melded their tonalities, and the drums were typically the most obvious element other than the vocals. In Want You Back by Haim, the Void again showed that it emphasized vocal sibilance. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Void rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The Void initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. However, when the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all melded. The drums generally were louder than the rest of the elements. The vocals remained 2 steps ahead of the other instruments. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Void presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. The bass was recessed further back than what I heard on the audeze 4X. All instruments melded their notes together slightly. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was marginally emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The Void could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The Void presented this detail. Overall, the Void has forward mids. Vocals, both male and female, will receive an emphasis in vocal grain and sibilance. There's about average clarity in this region. My tests indicate that the Void has a marginal emphasis in the upper treble region. In Scherzo X-Wings, the Void presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, the higher pitched notes seemed a bit emphasized, louder than what I heard on the more neutral Avantone planar. This emphasis was, however, similar to what I heard on the audeze 4X. The timpani was audible, but frankly underemphasized. The Void has some width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some like they were deeper into the room, but no sounds came from above or below. In flight from the city, the Void made the piano sound like it was 6 feet away. Its bassy notes were underemphasized and had fast transients. That was a little bit faster than the S4X in comparison. The cello was as loud as the piano. Both instruments remained clear when they played together. I could hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing effects. I also heard the creaking of the wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. In take 5 by the De Brubeck Quartet, the Void rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass several steps behind. All instruments melded their tonalities, but none seemed veiled in the mix. The saxophone was easily the loudest instrument in the mix. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes were louder, more energetic than what I heard on the Aventone planar. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. The Void made each cymbal strike sound the same. Overall, the Void has an upper treble emphasis. This is not significant, and it sounds similar to what the Olo S4X does. The only thing Moondrop says about the Void's detail ability is that it's clear in the higher frequencies. That's not much information for the potential buyer. My experience with the Void left me unimpressed, sadly. This headphone does a perfectly good job replicating what other headphones have already done at below or near its price tag, but I think it is far from a detail-oriented headphone. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps. The Focal Clear, 18 footsteps. The Austrian Audio HiX65, 16 to 17 footsteps. The HiX55 presents 16 footsteps. The HiX15 and the X25BT present 13 to 14. The Hi-Fi Mansandara, Aventone Planar, Sifka Phoenix, and Biodynamic DT1990 present 10 to 11 footsteps. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sifka Robin, and Ultrasound Pro 1480i all provide 8 to 9. The audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8 footsteps. The older M1060C provides 7 footsteps. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Void rendered 7 footsteps. On my scale of detail retrieval, the HD6XX and LCD1 are the average performers. Any headphone that provides more or less detail is judged accordingly. So the NDH20 would be considered as below average and the Hi-Fi Mansandara as above average. Here, based on this scale, I think the Void has average detail retrieval. Many audiophiles think that all open-back headphones have wide soundstage or that all closed-back headphones have narrow soundstage. That's not the case. Soundstage on headphones is a spectrum, and there's no hard and fast rule about it. For example, the closed-back Austrian Audio headphones have soundstage that is about as wide as the Hi-Fi Mansandara, and the open-back HD6XX has more narrow soundstage than the closed-back Shure SRH1540. Here, the Void does not present wide soundstage, at least not in the typical sense. If you come from Beats or Bose headphones, then yes, you could say that the Void is wide sounding, but compare it to other audiophile headphones and the experience is different. I have a soundstage scale. Once again, I use the HD6XX and LCD1 as my average performers. Headphones that have more or less soundstage than these two are judged accordingly. The audeze Mobius and all Beats headphones have claustrophobic soundstage. The NDH20 and ATH M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have average soundstage. The Sifka Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultrasound Pro 1480i have average to maybe above average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Mansandara, Aventone Planar, Austrian Audio HiX55 and X65, and the LCD2 Classic have above average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Mandiva has wide soundstage. The HD800S has super wide soundstage. In my opinion, the Void has soundstage that is a little bit wider than that of the HD6XX and LCD1, but is more narrow than that of the Hi-Fi Mansandara. So the Void soundstage is marginally above average. Moondrop has done a really poor job of explaining what their first headphone is supposed to do and sound like. They claim it is for enthusiasts and professionals, but you can find such promises from nearly every brand. It's nothing unique. Having listened to the Void for a lengthy period, I'd have to say that it presents a balanced mid-centric sound signature. Sub-bass is clearly underemphasized. There is no doubt that those who like bass rumble will find it lacking. Mid-bass seems closer to neutral. There's little bass bleed into the mids. The mids are forward, vocals are sibilant, and female artists receive a push in vocal grain as well. Vocals always stand further ahead of instruments, and instruments generally do not stand apart from each other, resulting in average clarity. The treble is fairly neutral until the upper treble, where there is an upward departure. Higher-pitched treble notes get an emphasis. However, the Void never sounds harsh or piercing. This headphone has average detail retrieval and marginally above average soundstage. Whether this perfectly fits the HRTF target or not is not really the issue. The bottom line is whether you will like what you hear. And that, unfortunately, is something you can answer only after listening to the headphone yourself. We need to conduct true A/B tests. That's the only way to have a more sober reflection of new gear amongst the constant hype. Here, we will compare the Void against the Sennheiser HD6XX, audeze LCD1, and the Apos Audio Caspian. For these tests, I used the stock accessories. I plugged the headphones into a passive A/B switch that was connected to my Brooklyn DAC Plus. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and tried to volume match. The 6XX and Void appear to have similar sub-bass rendition. Both are rolled off. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is a little bit more obvious on the Void. Mid-bass impact is similar between the two. There's marginally more bass bleed into the mids on the 6XX. The mids are forward on the Void, while on the 6XX they are closer to neutral. The Void emphasizes both sibilance and vocal grain. The 6XX does neither. Vocals stand about one step ahead of instruments on the 6XX, while they are 2 steps ahead on the Void. Vocals are a bit clearer in the mix on the Void. The treble is also different. The Void has an upper treble emphasis, the 6XX has an upper treble roll-off. Instruments in this region sound a little clearer on the Void. The Void has about as much detail as the 6XX, but is marginally wider in soundstage than the 6XX. The LCD1 has a sub-bass roll-off that is ever so slightly greater than that of the Void. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is similar. Transients is a little bit faster on the LCD1. Mid-bass impact sounds similar. Both the LCD1 and Void are vocal forward. Both push vocals ahead of instruments. Both emphasize sibilance and grain. However, the LCD1's sibilance push is marginally greater. Separation of mid-centric elements is similar. Vocals sound a little closer to the ears on the LCD1. Treble is a little bit different. The LCD1 has a marginal treble emphasis starting in the mid-treble all the way through into the upper treble. The Void has an upper treble emphasis. Neither headphone sounds harsh or piercing. They present similar clarity in this region. The LCD1 and Void have similar detail retrieval, but the Void has marginally wider soundstage. The Caspian's bass is quite different from the Void. The Caspian emphasizes both sub-bass and mid-bass. Clarity in this region is a little bit more obvious on the Void. The Caspian has a bit more bass bleed into the mids. The mids are forward on both headphones. Both emphasize vocal sibilance, and it sounds like the Void is ever so slightly more emphatic in this respect. The Void pushes vocal grain, but the Caspian does not. Vocals appear to be more separated from instruments on the Void. The treble is different. The Caspian has an upper treble roll-off, but the Void has an upper treble emphasis. The Void presents a bit more clarity in this region. The Caspian has slightly above average detail retrieval compared to the Void's average score. The Void has a bit more soundstage than the Caspian. Comparisons like these help us figure out what gear is worth considering. Maybe the stuff we currently have is plenty good. Maybe the hype is deserved. Here, it is clear that none of these headphones sound the same. They have different overall performance and sound signatures. While there are similarities, listening to one, then listening to another, results in hearing obvious differences. Whether you will like any of these products is something for you to decide. Moondrop makes good stuff. The Aria and Starfield are very popular IEMs, and I am a huge fan of their Quarks and use that IEM as a standard for neutrality. So, I had high hopes for the Void. On the one hand, you have to applaud Moondrop for trying something different. It's a risk, especially if it took 3 years to jump into headphones. Long-standing rivals from Sennheiser, along with newer competition from Apos or Audeze, are not easy products to dissuade people away from. So Moondrop had to do something unique enough to entice customers. I am not convinced they have succeeded. Let's first briefly discuss the sound signature. Whether the Void follows the HRTF target, the way it actually presents music is essentially mid-focused. Sub-bass is rolled off, mid-bass is fairly close to neutral, mids are forward and sibilant, and there's a marginal emphasis in upper treble. The Void has average detail and slightly above average soundstage. In my mind, I would call this a balanced sounding headphone aimed at those who prefer vocal presence. Maybe that's the type of sound signature you are looking for. What actually concerns me is the overall fit of the Void, something that is going to be divisive, I think. The Void's ear cups never made a full seal around my ears. There was always a slight gap near the bottom, and no amount of fiddling fixed that. The ear cups stop at 90 degrees to the yoke. That means wider heads will not get accommodated. The Void also has a fairly tight clamp. Now, over time, some of this will dissipate, but how long must you wait, or are you even willing to wait? The proprietary earpads present two problems. First, they are not particularly comfortable. The spongy foam causes hot spots and pressure points within 30 to 45 minutes of wearing these headphones. The second issue is that they are proprietary, using a unique mounting attachment. This means you cannot swap out earpads for others that are more comfortable. I am not remotely offended by the white pearlescent color scheme of this headphone. Frankly, I think it's unique. But white is not a color that typically stands the test of time. Oils off your hands and fingers, dust, and other environmental factors will eventually cause discoloration, and whether that takes months or years, only time will tell. My criticisms have nothing to do with the sound signature, which is an entirely personal matter. Instead, I'm concerned about the fit and comfort. If a headphone is uncomfortable, you won't use it. Even if you love the sound signature, how can you put yourself through that discomfort? This does not mean that the Void is a terrible headphone, but it does mean that there are going to be at least some portion of the market that will reject this headphone because of the fit, comfort, and proprietary earpads. At $200, we have lots of good options. Spend a bit more and the possibilities increase. When I first saw this headphone in person, I was confused by what I observed and then why the MSRP was what it was. Why is this headphone $200? My time wearing the Void convinces me that others are going to ask the same question. Comfort and fit are king. If it won't fit properly, if you can't wear it without constantly knowing it is clamping your head, you won't wear it at all, and you shouldn't keep it. This reminds me of the Blonde BL30, a headphone that otherwise sounded great, but was built with such incredible stupidity and incompetence that the end user was required to heavily modify it. The Void does not rise to that level, but it still presents a potential problem for some customers. Ultimately, whether you think the $200 MSRP is justified will depend on whether you think there's a good balance of sound signature and fit. I personally am not persuaded because of the latter.